Welcome to the Digital Analytics Power Hour. Michael, Mo, Tim, and the occasional guest discussing analytics issues of the day and periodically using explicit language while doing so. Find them on the web at analyticshour.io and on Twitter at analyticshour. And now, the Digital Analytics Power Hour.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Digital Analytics Power Hour. This is episode 151. You know, it just sits there blinking, sort of like a little line of doubt, daring you to try something. And it's usually green or some other not very word-like color. It's the command line, the IDE. For many of us analysts, our skills are not exactly highly technical. We look through data, we do analysis, we cobble together a story that we can share that highlights what we think is happening, what might be done about it. But let's face it, it's 2020 and the world isn't the same as it used to be. Python and R are basically required in many jobs. SQL is showing up as a requirement on more and more job descriptions. So here's the deal. You might have a ton of technical skills because you're an awesome data engineer, or you may be more like the data analyst, just taking your first faltering steps on the technical side. Well, welcome to this episode where we're going to talk about the intersection of these two skill sets. So let's meet our hosts. Mo Kiss is the marketing analytics lead at Canva. Heyo.
Hi, morning, evening. How you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing really good. And
Nice.
Tim Wilson, Senior Director of Analytics at Search Discovery.
How you going?
I'm going great. I don't know the right response to that. We'll get back to that. I'm Michael Helbling, the founder of Stacked Analytics. Okay, but we needed a guest, someone who lives this crossover day in and out. Claire Carroll is an analytics engineer and community manager of DBT at Fishtown Analytics. She's also held data roles at companies like Airtasker, Uber, and others. And today she is our guest. Welcome to the show, Claire.
Thank you so much for having me. I can confirm that how you're going, good is the correct way to answer that question.
Okay. So
Yeah.
That's good because we've always doubted Mo. And so getting some independent verification.
We're trying to line up as many Aussies as we can just to figure out if Mo starts yanking our chain and trying to come up with things, we'll go for it.
No, but that's a great idea.
Just do a whole Australian episode.
No, more have her tell us that, oh yeah.
Yeah. Misinformation.
We definitely should have organized beforehand.
Okay. Yeah. This is exactly what I would say. Yeah, that'll end well. Okay, Claire, welcome. So maybe to kick things off, let's talk a little bit about what you do day in and out. And then I think that's going to devolve into a deeper discussion about engineering and analytics and kind of how they're sort of merging together so much these days.
Okay. My day in and out looks very different each day. So I'm the community manager at Fishtown Analytics. We make software called DBT. And I actually live in the States. As we've already discussed, I have an Australian accent because I grew up in Sydney. And I moved over to the States around 2 years ago to take on this job.
Good timing. Good call. Sorry.
Yeah. In hindsight, maybe 2018 wasn't the best time to do that, but hindsight is 2020.
Sorry.
It's okay. I feel the same way many days. So yeah, at my job at Fishtown, I'm the DBT community manager, which means a whole lot of things. I spend my days working with clients and with community members on how they can best transform their data so they can use data to make really good decisions about their organizations. I hang out a lot on Slack, helping people that use the software, answering their questions. I write all the technical documentation. I write different blog posts, all these different things. And sort of all of that is in support of this bigger mission that our company has, which is to elevate the analytics profession. And our opinion is the way that we do that is to get analysts working a whole lot more like software engineers, which is where this term analytics engineer sort of came out of.
And yeah, I have to admit, Claire, you were the first person I heard say the term analytics engineer. We were lucky to have Claire at our data analytics meetup when she was visiting Sydney. So what do you mean when you say the term data analytics engineer? See, I'm already getting confused.
No, absolutely. Well, I have to give full credit to my friend, Michael Kaminsky, who originally coined the term. So Kaminsky wrote this post and I sort of read it and went, that actually describes the thing that I'd been doing. And sort of from there, we saw this title and took it on and have tried to really build community around this title, analytics engineer. So what does it actually mean? I guess it's worth going back to my prior role at Airtasker, where I did a whole lot more of this kind of work. So I was working as a data analyst. That was my title. And I was in charge of the entire data stack. We were using off-the-shelf tools to get data into our warehouse. We were using a BI tool to serve it up to our stakeholders. But there was a big in-between step, which was all this sort of transformation to get the data ready. So, data isn't always clean. In fact, I don't think it's ever clean. And it's never really in the format you need it to be in to be able to hand it over to a stakeholder so that they can start using it to do different analyses. And so I was working a lot in this sort of middle section of the stack. I was using SQL to transform my data. I was putting tests on it. I was documenting it. I was using version control. I was using the command line. I was using a code editor. My computer looked more like a software engineer's than it did sort of the analyst role that I'd started out with, sort of in the way that I set it out, dark mode everywhere. And yeah, this title of data analyst just stopped sort of making sense for me because it wasn't really the thing that I was doing. I wasn't really looking at the data that often and making decisions and, figuring out why did cancellation rates increase last week. Instead, I was making sure that if someone had that question, we had all the artifacts ready for them to be able to answer it. So I didn't really know what my title was. I didn't have this term. And then this post got published about maybe 6 months after I left that role. And I went, that's the thing that I was doing. It's analytics engineering.
And so, I have to confess at Canva, this is how Claire and I have also come to know each other. Canva is a very big user of DBT. And I would say that at our company, most analysts are a hybrid of data analyst and analytics engineer, in that we do all of the T of ELT. And I have to confess, I was there pre-DBT, and it has made life a lot easier in terms of that whole transformation piece. But yeah, I was just kind of thinking back, the first time I really heard of analysts doing that transformation piece was actually a friend of mine, Cohen, was working at OneFlare, and it feels like snowplow data really became that first piece where people had to start massaging the data a lot before it became usable. Is that something that you've seen in the US as well, or is that just my weird view of the world that I've seen?
No, I think that's definitely related. I think this role sort of came out of the evolution in the technology stack. So previously, if you wanted to get data into your warehouse, someone was writing the code to get it there. If you're using, say, Facebook ads, which a lot of companies use, someone was writing the Python code to hit the API and put it straight into your warehouse. And they'd sort of maybe do the transformation along the way. They'd make sure that it was all clean and flatten it out, whatever needed to happen. And they'd also spend time, making sure that the warehouse was available and, people could actually run queries against it. And those two things have just really been automated by technology. So whether it's, using a cloud warehouse like Snowflake, Redshift, BigQuery, whether it's using an off-the-shelf extract and load tool, Stitch, Fivetran, just those pieces don't really make sense anymore. The problem then, though, is that if you have data in your warehouse that is exactly the spec of the API, which is what these extract and load tools do, they're sort of source conformed. It's all about, how does Facebook name this field? You end up giving it to end users in a format that they can't really make sense of. Maybe the columns are really inconsistently named. Maybe they need to have those two ad sources together. And so then all these other problems of having access to raw data starts to crop up. People try to do their own analysis and end up with different numbers. You have to remember all the time, make sure to exclude user ID 1. That's the CEO. They're not actually a real user. Make sure to filter out these deleted at records. All these sort of problems come up, and the way that you can get ahead of those problems is to transform your data before you hand it to your stakeholders. So it is sort of that, seeing the rise of Snowplow with your friend at OneFlare, definitely related. Sort of these tools where data was coming in, but just wasn't quite ready yet. I think we're seeing that across the stack. Is
it analogous to, I guess one aspect of being an analyst or being a technical analyst, there is, at least in the digital analytics world, there is still all the world of JavaScript and tag managers and the data collection, which still feels like this other kind of weird beast, because it's not going and getting data from the transactional system. It's actually putting the instrumentation to collect the data in place. But I think the other thing is, you're talking and explaining this, which makes a whole lot of sense. It sounds like the same discussion, I'd love it if it was the same discussion around having a data lake and a data warehouse, where this idea of just throw everything in the data lake and you get in there a lot more quickly. But then there's a recognition that, but you don't want to just open the data lake up for all those reasons you just listed. Like it's too messy. Some stuff needs to happen. So is the data lake to a data warehouse world analogous to an analytics engineer saying, I'm getting the data from some intermediate raw form and into a transformed spot?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm definitely in the group of people that thinks data lake and maybe thinks data swamp every so often. Hopefully no one takes offense at that. But yeah, it's those same problems, just different terminology around the tools we use.
Well, because the business seems to assume that, like, once you have the data in the data swamp. I mean, I've got a client, big pharma client, that it's infuriating, because they told us for like over the course of a year, they're like, that data is going into they would just refer to it as the hub, or they'd call it Azure or Azure. I'm still not sure how that's pronounced. And the reality is there's a data lake and kind of a mart world there. And it was the lack of precision. Like, they would say, that data is going into this. And it's like, yeah, but there's access, documentation, cleaning, getting it to somewhere we can use it. So it still seems like there's still some kind of naivete on the business side that, it's just data's in one spot, you move it to another spot, and now you can visualize, slice, and work on it, and kind of miss that whole, I guess, the T, basically, to get it into a repeatably usable format.
Yeah,
maybe? Okay.
I agree with that.
Sometimes he rambles.
Well, I'm the most not clear on this role. I guess the role in the space is one that I'm not coming across in my day-to-day life, but at the same time, I've got our scripts written where I take and pull data out of somewhere, and then my script does a bunch of stuff. Mm-hmm. And I've got version control on it. Like, I'm checking it into, through Git, but I'm like, that's servicing just me. Like, this feels like, well, yeah, but how do I get 3 other analysts to use that same cleansed data? Like, well, they get the repo and run the same script. That's not right. So yeah, I'm continuing to ramble. You want to say, and there he goes again? Yeah.
So Claire, I just wanted to ask, at my previous company, data engineers were responsible for this. And I'm like, I've talked previously, this is something I always discuss internally about whether we have the balance right. What are some of the pros of having an analytics engineer, I guess, look after the T versus a data engineer?
Yeah, pros and cons, I'd say to both. So again, part of this is like the tooling around, like, enabling this move. So previously you really did need a data engineer to do these things, because you had to use Python to transform data. You maybe had to use Spark, Hadoop, all these things that, like, I'm not going to pretend that I know in deep detail. But the reality is that the warehouse, if you're using a modern cloud warehouse, you can do all of it in SQL, and it's usually as performant and much, much more accessible. So the pros of having sort of this person in the middle, an analyst who has SQL experience doing this work, is that it just makes it so much easier to make changes. I've worked with, so earlier in my role, I was doing consulting. I'm actually not doing that at the moment. But I worked with a client where everything was in Python. And when anything broke, it was just so hard to figure out what was going on. That observability wasn't there because it was just like so many layers removed from the final artifact. Data engineers are also incredibly expensive. So putting that work on them, I don't know, maybe it's not the best use of resources. But I also think, like, as a data engineer, if you're the person that's in charge of the transformation, it just becomes a blocker to people who need to get work done. New data comes into the warehouse, and if you can't do anything with it until someone else has worked on it, it can really limit like how quickly and how quickly you can work on your data and how agile you can be.
Don't data engineers also, I think of separate from as you're describing the analytics engineer, if I'm actually trying to push a model out, like if the analytics engineer or the analyst has built something, when it comes to a like performance and low latency on a model that's pushed into production that could be generated by a data scientist or someone, doesn't that sort of fall squarely into the data engineer to figure out how to make that happen?
Before we go into that, what do you mean by model?
Well, so if there's like machine learning and there's like we've pulled stuff off and now we've done some fancy gradient boosting classification, whatever it is, and now we want to put that model into production so that we're personalizing a user experience with super low latency. So now we've got something that we've proven has a degree of predictive capability that's useful that we can act on, but it's only going to be useful if it is running and put out into the world for making decisions.
Yeah, I think that falls into data engineering world, or machine learning engineering even is another title I see quite frequently. That's not sort of where my experience is in terms of building predictive models. So I don't want to come across as an expert on a thing that I'm not an expert on. But I think that is the area that falls into data engineering. I think the analogous part in analytics is, let's say you built this huge transformation in SQL and an analyst had built it. There is a risk that an analyst won't really do the right performance optimization on that model. There's a lot to learn how to work with your warehouse as opposed to against it, what performance SQL looks like, how to break up your code into separate pieces so that it's easier to debug and those sorts of things. So that is sort of where things get really blurry. If you've got analyst, data engineer, and someone's got to write the transformation code, if it's those are your only two choices and it's an analyst, there is a risk there. I'm not going to say that every analyst is bad at writing SQL. I think that's a really bad way to see the world. Many analysts are fantastic at writing SQL, but it's about understanding how do I work with the data warehouse that I have to make sure that things run quickly. Those principles often we see more on the data engineering side. So I think that's sort of one of the trade-offs that comes into play when you're thinking about who does this work.
Yeah, and I think particularly as that's kind of a teething problem that we're starting to hit as well, where we built stuff not a fair while ago, but our data set grows so quickly every single day that we're now having to go back and really optimize things. And it really becomes this partnership between those in our team who are really on the analytics engineering side and our data engineers to be cool, let's all sit together. We need to figure out how to optimize this because the sheer scale of data is getting so big that if we don't optimize it, the run times just take, you get to the point where your data is out of date because the runtime takes so long, and that's the whole reason you don't want to go down this path. So I feel optimization and efficiency of queries becomes a really big issue. Just out of curiosity, if you're an analytics engineer who's starting to face this, how would you tackle it?
Know some really good data engineers and ask for help. I think it is the word you said there was partnership. And I think that's a thing that's so valuable is having data engineers. If you're on a larger team, data engineers who, can maybe look at your query and provide feedback on how it could be more performant or start to break it down into smaller steps. Myself, when I had to learn these things, I was a one-person data team. So I did rely a lot on the community that I now manage and was just asking people in the data community, like, what is going on? Why isn't this query working? Or why is it taking so long? And yeah, learning from those in my network as well. It's a pretty hard thing to learn from first principles, I think.
This is so funny. My son is taking a performance class right now. And like, he literally dropped another class because he'd rather geek out on this one class that much more. And he's like, it's kind of funny. Like last night he was commenting on, they're doing rotating a matrix, and I think they're using like Silk or something. And he was like, I got it down from 2100 milliseconds to, 39 milliseconds. And I just did this thing. And he was trying to explain it to me. And I was like, yeah, this is like talking to a data scientist. I want to follow what you're saying, kid, but I'm becoming a grandparent apparently.
Oh,
But
seriously.
But that idea of performance, because it does seem like that progression of the analyst to initially I run it and I say, it runs for a minute. That's enough time to go grab a cup of coffee. Well, now my data set keeps growing. Well, now it's like 5 minutes. I still don't really care, but now it's like starting to kick the fan up on my, laptop, and other people want it, and now they want to do something, and now it's growing over time to where an analyst plots out and says, well, this is going to be taking an hour and a half. It does seem like a different skill set. I worry a little bit about the analyst. I used to worry about this with digital analytics, that it's alluring to get sucked into I'm going to capture new data, or I'm going to prep the data. And I'm going to assume, and this happens with like the Adobe Analytics world, there are definitely people out there who are like, we're going to do all this cool data collection, and then we'll just assume that somebody's going to work with it. And then you realize that your entire analyst team is so busy collecting and organizing the data and just assuming and hoping that now somebody's going to get use from it. I don't know. Do you, like the whole analytics engineer, like as you were describing kind of your rolling into that, and you said I wasn't really doing the analysis, but that feels like this kind of danger. It's a nice career progression from getting to the data's in a better spot, but is there a risk for organizations that, oh crap, we have all our analysts doing stuff with the data that is getting it cleaner and better and transformed, but we've now understaffed and we can't rely on our business. We're not getting it to a point where the business can just get into a BI tool and get actionable insights from it.
Yeah. I think that's definitely a risk. And I've seen some teams go in that direction. Personally, when I'm working with data, doing analytics engineering, I'm working with the stakeholder first and understanding, what are they trying to get out of the data? What questions are they asking? What's the business question? What's the data question? Do those two actually match up? Do we need to be asking different data questions? And working backwards from there to figure out what data do I need and then fill it in with what data do I have. I have definitely seen teams start to go sometimes in the other direction where they start out with their raw data and then they think, ooh, what is the final absolutely modeled data mart that I need to build? And that's kind of a little scary to me because I think you can end up building the wrong thing or building something that's not useful or just investing a lot of time in something that
literally used 10 years ago was the Data Warehouse Institute did a study that said, why do data warehouses fail? And it's because that was the approach. We're going to build everything in this glorious data warehouse and it's going to be amazing. And they just weren't incremental enough and they weren't focused on what's the specific questions. So it gets back to the same thing that a data analyst was doing, which is don't just say, if somebody says, can I get X, and think, let me go solution and give X, it still goes back to that, hold on, let's figure out what we're really trying to do so that we can provide a better solution, kind of think through all the nuts and bolts.
I really do like the idea of also, Claire, you mentioned, really thinking through what's the final output going to be? What's the dashboard that we want to be at the end of this? Our team has gotten into the practice now of wireframing a dashboard before we even start working on a model or a report table, because then the stakeholders are like, this is what the output is going to look like and how I'm going to use it. And you can really marry up those two things. But I think Tim does raise a really interesting point, and this is why I love this topic so much, is like the analytics engineering is a lot of heavy lifting and it is really time consuming. And like I mentioned earlier, our team's dual hat, so they do the analysis as well, is like how you get that balance right of making sure you're doing that model and report building, but also having the time to do the analysis. And I feel like we're just starting to hit our stride with that. But I think it must be a problem that lots of teams come up against.
I think you get the balance right by getting it wrong and adjusting from there. I think sort of at one extreme of things of, if you were only ever working with a stakeholder and answering that business question, you'd end up building one process to answer that one question. And every time you need to answer a new question, it's a totally new, transformation or analysis that you need to do. On the other side of things, it's trying to answer everything from the outset. And that's also sort of those risks we were discussing earlier of investing too much in the infrastructure and then not delivering value. And so I think it's a bit of balance. It's picking a few things to start out with, a few, report that needs to be automated. And currently someone's downloading it to Excel and doing a lot of VLOOKUPs and, figuring out how can I make that process easier. And then building in like these extra, I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, like doing it sort of one analysis at a time, but like keeping an eye on like how does the big picture fit together. It's a really hard skill to master, and I think it is just one of those ones that you like master over time, balancing like those two things.
Yeah, I'm having flashbacks right now to the early days with WebTrend software, where you literally had to pre-plan any report because the database was not relational unless you related the dimensions prior to analyzing any data. So it's sort of that same thing, is sort of like if you don't get one and you're like, oh, we need this other report, suddenly you've got to go back and rebuild it and reanalyze all your log files back in those days. But in the same way, like, it's sort of like, yeah, we've got all this data. Okay, how do we want this data to come out? It's very hard to predict exactly how you want it to come out ahead of time. So that's a tough challenge. I kind of think there's something I'm noticing as I read through your blog post about the analytics engineer, and we're touching on it a little bit, so maybe it's just a little bit of a different tack, but it seems like not just the technical side of it, but the analytics engineer also seems to need to have a pretty significant amount of business domain knowledge to be able to help drive the business need for the data into that place where they're kind of sitting in the middle. Can you talk a little bit about what you think is required there in terms of what an analytics engineer would need to do?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So how much business knowledge does an analytics engineer need?
Or just talk to kind of like domain expertise is sort of one hand, it seems like, and then the technical expertise is maybe the other, and kind of bringing those together seems like where the analytics engineer sits. So maybe the relative importance, those kinds of things.
Well, it seems like you were talking about the needing to probe for what the business, like the whole active users and re-ups, like I'm hearing, like, how does that, you've got to be able to engage with the business and understand the business to actually do the necessary probing, I think, right?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. There's so many different skills to learn, like in this role. It's, technical skills and business knowledge. And then also, I think, sort of a separate kind of domain knowledge, which is things like product analytics and marketing analytics and financial analytics and all those sorts of different things. I think as an analytics engineer, I feel pretty confident that I could walk into another organization and be hopefully pretty good at my role. I think you get set up really well with this like technical base that then means like learning the business things on top of that make like those things are so much easier to learn as opposed to having to.
But actually, is your framing it? Is it because if you've got I want to ask a question about a talent and like what a shitty analytics engineer looks like. But if you've got the analytics engineer kind of skills and ability, then when you're engaging with the business, say at a new client or new employer, you're thinking through aren't you approaching it from a data perspective to be asking questions about, I need to ask questions about the business because I'm playing forward in my head 2 or 3 or 4 or 10 steps of what that actually means for the data and for analysis. So
one thing that does come to mind, like on this topic, is that the best analytics engineers that I know are people that haven't come from an engineering background. Hopefully none of my friends from that background hear this and are upset by that. But honestly, the best analytics engineers are those that like were from an analyst background, from an operations background is another really common one, or a finance background. And so they actually had that like business context of, you know, what does this number mean and why is it important? And they ended up falling into these analytics engineer roles because they got curious about data, or they got frustrated with the quality of, you know, the data that they were working with, and just kept asking sort of why on the other end of the stack, more on the technical side of the stack. And so I think that those like business skills are super valuable and key to being a really good analytics engineer, because if you're not asking the right questions, you'll just end up building things that aren't valuable, and that's a way to be a pretty bad analytics engineer, I guess.
But so where's the balance? So I was basically working where, I was a solo analyst, and I was doing a lot of the analytics engineering, I guess, prepping what we needed. And I remember calling my sister, and she's like, what the hell are you doing? You're building for 2 years' time. Like, this company is probably going to look so different in 2 years' time. Like, what do they need for the next 6 months, and build that? How do we get that balance right? Because I feel like that is one of the trickiest parts when you delve into this analytics engineering world. Like, you can keep optimizing and like trying to think of every single use case that this is going to answer. Or do you really hone it down to like, it needs to be used for this one case, and that's what I'm building for?
That's such a good question. I think I think that idea of like, what is the timeline you're building for is such a valuable like question to ask yourself as an organization. I know that like in my last few months at Airtasker, we had Dan Gooden come in as the data lead. Absolutely fantastic. And we had this big session where we were sort of saying, we're going to build the infrastructure that's going to last us for 2 years, which was like a total shift and like a sign of maturity for that organization. But I think asking that question of your own organization is really valuable, because it helps you understand like, what is the trade-off that I should be making? Like, which way should I be biasing? Because there is like build the thing that does the thing once, or build the version that is innately flexible, but then much more complicated to debug if something goes wrong, because maybe you've got extra code happening there. So from my perspective, it's always like start off with the one that solves the single use case, and then refactor it so that it can solve maybe a few more use cases. A really concrete example, one that I've actually been working on recently, I'm doing some pro bono work at the moment with a nonprofit, and they have a lot of survey data. And this survey data is structured in a very particular way, where like Boolean responses live in one table, string responses live in another, date responses live in another. And they have different surveys. Like every so often, someone creates a new survey, and then the person on the other end of this survey wants the flat, like the wide table of survey responses. They're using it to inform who they're calling up to tell them to register to vote. And so this is an example where they'd sort of built the first version just to solve for the one survey, and they got it to work, and we refactored it so it was pretty tidy, but it wasn't doing anything more than it needed to do. It was sort of setting its, like the way we wrote the code, I'm so passionate about SQL style, like using a lot of CTEs and naming things really well and being intentional about those choices, meant that then when they came back around and said, okay, we have a new survey, can we make this do 2 things? And we went, okay, we're going to do a bit of copy and paste for this one. But now when we're at like 10 surveys, then we can start to look at, is it worth like making this code really flexible, maybe generating the code, using like extra things outside of SQL. But we really like started off with the simple version. I myself am like, was absolutely guilty of over refactoring. I don't know if that's a term, but like getting too clever with my code and being like, look at all the cool things I can do. Like I can write a UDF to date trunk to a week, but I could just also use
pro bono. You can do whatever you want.
That's right.
It stimulates your intellect for providing that.
Yeah. So I think like I personally, maybe a year ago, like around that sort of time, I was like working too far on the side of like, let me show you how clever I'm going to be and how I can automate all of this. And it ends up with something that's like harder for your end user to understand. So if it's sort of that like over, like going too far and then pulling it back and like recorrecting, I think is a process that I feel like.
Okay, I've got to ask this. So with DBT, and I think it's pronounced Ginger, but it's with a J, which is basically like a templating language that you can throw in your SQL to get it to do a whole bunch of stuff that it wouldn't normally be able to do. Like I look at our code base now, and if you were a straight SQL person, like there gets a point where you're doing things that are so fancy, it's probably not going to become readable to someone new. What's the balance there?
Yeah, I think that's a thing that I've seen happen in a lot of organizations. So for those who aren't familiar with Ginger, it's a templating language. Think like if you were to send a marketing email, and if you ever like accidentally received an email that says like, hi, first name in 2 curly brackets, and you're like, oh, something went wrong here. So it's that templating language. And that templating language, using it with SQL, means that you can do things like generate the correct SQL for the survey ID, survey ID 42, even though that SQL actually needs to look different each time, but you can use like templates and things like that. And then I think that is an example where like people can get too clever with things. And it's finding the balance, figuring out what's right for your organization.
I would take the people who are too clever, as long as they're aware that they're being a little too clever and might have recognized they've gone down that and made something that's not necessarily extensible. Because the ray of hope I'm getting that we won't have a bunch of dunderheads calling themselves analytics engineers is that I look at what many analysts that I have come across in my professional life who their spreadsheets are shit. And they have their one-time case of, I've got to produce this report, and they put zero investment to, you're going to have to produce that again a week later. And they put nothing into it. And so the next week they spend 80% as long as they spent the first time producing it. And they will go on down that. So it's like the opposite, Mo, from the high growth, our data exploding. Take the big ass enterprise that is not moving quickly, and you take an analyst who's going to say, well, I'm going to export this from this system, and then I'm going to import it into Excel. And even there, they don't get it down to, how can I streamline the crap out of this? So to me, there is kind of there's got to be a self-selection where somebody who is working in spreadsheets and is saying, okay, this is getting ridiculous. My formulas are way too long. Oh crap, I'm writing VBA and I know that that's fragile. And they're the ones who are going to be drawn, because it does feel like there has to be some talent, some ability to recognize there's a continuum between down and dirty, fastest to produce, and getting too clever, but essentially infinitely extensible. I think there are plenty of people out there who are data analysts who don't even internalize and understand that continuum. And they are so destructive, and they will wind up filling their days doing the same damn thing over and over again, and then pissing and moaning about, I'm just doing reporting, because they have no ability to make anything efficient. And rant complete. I have earned us the explicit tag for this episode.
Great job.
So I don't know. The way you are framing it to me sounds like anybody who's listening and saying that makes so much sense. Okay. Analytics engineer, possibly a career progression for you. People saying, what the hell are they talking about? It's like, I feel like our audience is all phenomenal. I might have had current and past clients who caused my blood pressure to go up a bit, but I love them all.
Yeah. I think you touched on a really good point. Like, it is the people who are frustrated with like having to repeat processes who find themselves drawn to this side of things. Like, why do I have to write that query every single time? Why do I have to run this query? Like, why can't it just be a thing that I reuse again and again, as opposed to having to redo it? People who are asking those questions, I think, are going to benefit a lot from analytics engineering. I think this is true in life in general. Anyone who's like scared of automating, like, having parts of their role replaced by, tooling or anything like that. Maybe I shouldn't put it this way. Let me rephrase this. I think it's that curiosity of like, how can I make this process easier and less manual that like drives a lot of people towards analytics engineering. For anyone that does enjoy repetitive tasks, maybe I have fewer words to say.
Have you looked into the world of quality assurance?
I have, but we automate it. Yeah.
No, I'm saying for people who enjoy repetitive tasks.
Yeah.
No, but QA, you should be automating your QA too. Although Selenium, Yeah.
But I find that is like less compelling than sort of this discussion or intersection. Yeah. The other thing that's really sticking out to me, and Claire, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this concept as it's relatively new in our space, is this role of the analytics translator. And so,
oh my God,
Tim, it's funny, Tim, that you'd have that reaction, but then it's literally like analogous to the analytics engineer in so many different ways.
No, that is a bullshit cop-out person.
I totally, don't agree.
It's not the same, but it is actually sort of sits in between these two functions.
No, it is a lazy fuck who wants to say, I don't want to actually have analytics talent, but I'm intrigued by this idea of analytic. No.
So when Gary Angel brought that forward to eMetrics 2 years ago, you had a negative reaction to him saying that.
I did. Because
you did.
Okay, you got to catch me up. What's the analytics translator?
Don't worry about it. But it's interesting because I find that it's sort of another role that's being described as sort of this hybrid between sort of these two things. And so like, that's why it kind of...
No, go ahead and define it because then we can see. Claire can be like, oh yeah.
No, it's the analytics translator is basically someone who sits in between the business and the analytics function within a company. That's it.
So we had this guy who came to me and basically was like, cool, I want to work in analytics. And I was like, great. So you should probably learn like SQL or R or Python, all the languages that everyone in our team use. And he was kind of like, well, I don't really want to do that. I'm like, great. So how are you going to get data? And he was like, well, someone else would pull it for me, which, I mean, come on, like, what?
I had the same example with somebody who said the same thing.
So Mo, hold on. You need to distinguish between someone who's just lazy versus someone who actually performs a function.
Oh no, apparently this is called strategic analysis. This was the term that he used to describe the role.
That's fine, but you can't do analysis with an understanding of the underlying data or the ability to even go get your own data.
I had the exact same thing with a former coworker who came to me at a meetup and said, like, oh, I found this.
Claire, we'll be back with you in a minute here.
Yeah.
Oh, good. I'm enjoying this.
It was the exact thing. But that is what we need more data literacy amongst our business users because
bullshit will be persistent. We'll always face that. Okay, let's move off of this. It's just interesting to me to see these things as patterns that sort of emerge. Okay, there's one other topic that I kind of want to delve into, which, Claire, I think you can do this. And, Mo and Tim, I'd be interested in your perceptions as well, but like,
well, you're wrong.
Actually, I'm sorry. I'm always right, on. Tim. And that's the weird thing about it. So, you just pick an area.
Must be so wonderful.
It works. It's been working out pretty well for me so far. So one thing that I've been sort of feeling about analytics, and of course we come from the digital analytics space, so it's sort of like the Google Analytics and Adobe Analytics are our bread and butter a lot of times. But our space is getting a lot more complicated. So if you look at kind of where analytics is going, so like, let's call it the modern analytics stack or whatever you want to call it. So that is changing how people are having to interact with this. And I think, to your point, Claire, this is where the analytics engineer basically is coming from, is filling in where we're now modularizing the entire analytics stack. And there's all these new roles that have to be fulfilled. Does anybody find it stressful, like that this is happening? Because I do. Like, our challenges are still fundamentally the same, but the technical aspects of it have grown in complexity dramatically because some of the things that were out of our hands before, like the processing of data and how that data was going to turn into reports, was sort of managed by a tool that had positives and negatives. A lot of negatives, actually. But anyways, I'm just curious what people's response to that is.
I think there is so many different aspects of being a data practitioner now, like just someone on a data team. There's so many different things that you have to have the context of to be a really effective practitioner. Mo, I was speaking with your coworker, Vinci, about a project she'd been working on to pull mobile like screen views into your sessionization model. And that conversation was like so many different pieces of the stack. It was like working with your growth marketers, working with data engineers, working with like front end engineers, all these different things. I think it is a really challenging aspect of being someone in data right now. The thing that is good at the moment is that a lot of the easier tasks are being automated. So I had never written my own code to put data from an API into Snowflake prior to about a month ago when I wrote my first ever Singer tap. Because Stitch Fivetran was just always doing it for me. And I understood how it worked. I knew the context of it, but I never done it myself. And you can get like pretty far with off-the-shelf tooling to just, like, as long as you understand what that tool does and what it's best at and how to use it the right way. So you can end up being like gluing a lot of pieces together and getting pretty far. But the hard part is, I think, the context of like knowing all these different aspects.
And I have also been meaning to do a shout out to Vinci, who gave me some really interesting questions to add to the show. She is the DBT guru, one of the gurus in our team. So I do want to do a quick shout out to her. And thank you to her for taking on that screen view project, because that would have like been the death of me.
Yeah.
I mean, doesn't it come down to an organization that is willing to be kind of creative and flexible with like, what are the kind of pieces and parts from skills and talent that we need to put together? And then I think it goes to, don't hire anybody as a data practitioner who isn't frustrated that there are not enough hours in the day for them to learn it all. Like, I think that's what's toxic, is having somebody who wants their role to be static. And I feel like we've talked about this as like, if you're in the world of data these days, like you better be taking step functions forward in what you understand every year, or you are going to get left behind. And so it seems like those two need to come together. And yeah, the reorg may need to happen periodically because, you know what? We need like 3 analytics engineers. We had 0 last year. What's getting us on a path to do that? Who internally can move into that role? What do we need to hire? So I think there needs to be a recognition that it needs to be dynamic, both the talent and the organization. And I feel like I'm seeing a lot of organizations that don't have one of those other pieces and are struggling.
Well, and I think the other thing is people have got to take a step back on strategy. And Claire, I think you made that point. We were talking about how you had an analytics leader come in and said, hey, we're going to build the infrastructure that's going to last us for the next 2 years. Let's take a step back and really think through it. That's the other thing, is because there's this constant iteration happening. This may or may not be a conversation that I just had today with a developer in BigQuery, which is, hey, I think there's some issues with definitions across this team and defining sources of truth. And they're like, it's so annoying. I'm like, that's literally every company for all time. Like, that's how it always is. And it's sort of like, well, then how do we get around those things? And like, strategy is sort of like becomes so crucial at those moments. Anyways, it's just
and governance, right? It seems like even in the analytics engineering world, you can't just be marching off down your own path and not having a mechanism for documenting and getting those definitions figured out and recorded and aligned on, right?
I have to say that's one of the things that I've really loved about our move. I mean, to be honest, our team was always really good at it, but the thing that I've loved the most, when I review any code, the thing that I'm probably the toughest on is the documentation, because people are so like in their zone about their area that they know what a particular field means. And I'm like, yeah, but you've got 25 other analysts now who might need to pick up this table and use it. And if you use the word session in the help center, which has a different definition to what session means in marketing, for example, or even like a location code or something like that. Like you need to be really explicit so everyone is speaking the same language and knows the differences for how different terms are used. I feel like the documentation, like that's the thing that I probably love the most about analysts doing more of this analytics engineering is like they actually do know what that field means probably better than anyone else in the business.
Yeah. I remember at my last role, our API engineering lead was like, yeah, we've got a pretty complex API. There's like 150 tables in the back end. No one, people specialize on different parts of the back end. No one really knows what's in all those tables. Oh, except for the data team. They know what's in every single table, which I think is very true in your case too. Like when analysts are working with data, they just know so much about like what this field means. And it's crazy to me when that information lives in their head as opposed to written down in a YAML file that someone else can access and review and edit and all those things. It's a really quick, if those things live in your head, it's a really quick way to make sure that you never progress in your role, because every time someone has a question, they're going to be coming to you to answer it as opposed to, checking the documentation.
The YAML files do make it so easy.
It goes back. Where can I write this down so that I can point people to this so that I can move on in my career? So it goes back to the same. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we have to start to wrap up, and this conversation is really good.
There's so many things we haven't talked about.
No, I know. It's always the way it is on the good episodes. All right. Well, one thing we do love to do is go around and share a last call. So, Claire, you're our guest. Do you have a last call you'd like to share?
Yeah. So my last call is that we have our inaugural user conference coming up. It's December 7th to 11th. It's called Coalesce, which hopefully most of your audience appreciate that name. It's 4 days. Each day is in a different time zone. Very fortunate to have Canva as one of our online hosts, all online. We're really excited. We're only a little bit nervous, but I'd love to see some faces from this call and the audience there as well.
Outstanding. Yeah, I think it'll be an excellent event, and it sounds like there's going to be a lot of great content shared, which I'm already on the record as telling people if you're not part of the DBT community, Slack community, you should probably get in there. It's like 7,000 people or more now. So
I think we just hit 7,000.
Yeah. So
by the time this airs, it may not be as easy to get an invite. But
it'd probably be 8,000 by the time after we just talk about it. I mean, we're going to get a huge bump. And just kidding. All right, Mo, what about you? Do you have a last call you'd like to share?
Yeah, I just want to do a shout out actually to Claire and the team at Fishtown Analytics, their blog and the DBT blog. I mean, I look at it at least every week. It's an absolute lifesaver. And I actually find if you are starting to explore with DBT, it just is so, I sometimes struggle when I go through like other people's blogs, and particularly when it gets quite technical, I get completely lost and I need a human to explain it to me. And I find that all of the articles that Claire and the team put together are so readable, and I actually leave the site being like, oh, I know how to do this thing now. So it's been on my last call list forever, but it seems like today is really the appropriate day to do a shout out.
Oh, thank you so much. I have a very lovely story about that blog if you want to hear it very quickly.
Sure.
Let's hear it.
I read an article. You can find this message in DBT Slack. It's from January 2017. I read an article on the Fishtown blog, was an analyst in Sydney, and I said that exact same thing. I said, hey, I read this article and it made sense, and everything else I'd read on data just had not made sense. It's the Startup Founder's Guide to Analytics, written by Tristan Handy, CEO, still relevant today. And that was basically how I found my way into DBT Slack and DBT community, and using the software, and then 2 years later moved over to work for the company. So pretty crazy way to be introduced to an organization, but it resonates.
Very cool.
Nice.
Okay, Tim, what about you? What's your last call?
Well, I'll do one that's been on my list forever, but I would like to say it's just so appropriate for this topic. It's about this role of an analytics translator. No. Everything after that was actually true. I totally just whiffed and I'd screwed up the URL, and so it was broken. And I was like, whenever this comes back up, I want to last call it. But it was a totally user error on my end. But Jordan Peck, this was several months ago, wrote a post called SQL versus R, which to use for data analysis. So it's not trying to solve it R versus Python or SQL versus R versus Python. It just makes he does a very clean job of going through and saying, this is what works here. This is what works better here. And his closing note was, can you use a SQL database to perform analysis or use R to build a reliable data pipeline? Of course you can. Just be wary of the pitfalls and the difficulties going into it, which to me just seemed like a good episode to throw that into, because it does come down to, and even Claire, in your article about analytics engineering, you talk about kind of the different, that the whole tech stack, like we are in a point where we're putting multiple pieces together. You can't just learn Google Analytics. You can't just learn Excel, and you've got to kind of understand the broader landscape. And that even comes to the coding. So various people have written SQL, R, Python stuff, but I thought Jordan's was a nice little write-up. What you got, Michael?
Well, I'm glad you asked, Tim. I'm excited to announce my new YouTube channel, The Analytics Translator. Why it's better than anything, Tim. No, I'm just kidding. I'm joking. Wouldn't that be hilarious if that was what it was, though? Okay. No. So actually, recently I found someone new to follow on Twitter who works for Google. His name's Lakshmanan. I'm probably mispronouncing his name, but he works with the data analytics and AI solutions on Google Cloud, and he and his team write a lot of the training content and things like that. And so I got introduced to him through some things that interaction on Twitter, and then started diving into some of the Google Cloud training, which I think is actually pretty cool. And he also has a book, which is currently in pre-order, but it's Machine Learning Design Patterns by O'Reilly. So it's looks like it might actually be a pretty good book to have for those who are going to take some time to go beyond just analytics engineering and get into machine learning. All right. Well, we know as you've been listening, you probably have tons of questions, lots of comments, and we'd love to hear from you. And the best way to do that is through the Measure Slack or the DBT community Slack, either one of those, because you can find definitely me and Claire on the DBT Slack. And I'm sure by the time this goes live, Mo, you will also be on there. Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah. Mo actually knows how to use DBT. I don't. I'm just part of the Slack community.
Not well, to be clear.
Well, I just think it's hilarious because, I believe, very much in the idea of it. So I'm in the community. I have no idea how to use the product. So it's just every little bit helps. Anyways, we'd love to hear from you. You can also talk to us on Twitter or on our LinkedIn group, and we'd love to hear your comments and questions. Claire, do you interact with people in other places besides the DBT community that you'd want to shout out, like Twitter or anything like that?
I do have Twitter. It's Claire B. Carroll. And yeah, I am on there pretty frequently, usually making terrible jokes. So don't expect any high quality content there.
I like it. Memes and jokes. Those are the best kind. All right. Well, no show would be complete without a shout out to our awesome producer, Josh Crowhurst, who does such an amazing job helping us deliver the show to you, the listener. So thank you, Josh, from all of us.
If this episode has sounded smooth and seamless throughout, just know that Josh did a hell of a job to get you to this point.
There's this new role emerging of the podcast translator. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, so yeah, we do appreciate it. All right, so I know that no matter the challenges of the modern analytics stack, no matter whether you started out as a developer or a philosophy major who got into analytics through marketing, I know I speak for my two co-hosts, Mo and Tim, when I say, keep analyzing.
Thanks for listening. And don't forget to join the conversation on Twitter or in the Measure Slack. We welcome your comments and questions. Visit us on the web at analyticshour.io or on Twitter at analyticshour.
So smart guys wanted to fit in, so they made up a term called analytics. Analytics don't work.
Analytics. Oh my God.
What the fuck does that even mean? Tim, did you even cover the logistics?
I really feel like that should be the responsibility of the moderator. If he just wrote the intro before 6 p.m.
I wrote part of it before, but I didn't write it on the actual document.
No, this one you say, I've been thinking about it for weeks. It's been up here.
It's been percolating.
It's sort of just, don't mess with my process.
Can you see that we have two people with very different work styles here? It frequently blows up in our pretty little faces.
Maybe even three people with different work styles, Mo. I don't know.
Well, I like to think I'm the happy median.
Where have the most fireworks occurred?
Okay,
Fireworks have been
so let me work quickly to talk a little bit about some logistics, Claire, since no one else is willing to do so. Well, it's just America is...
on the brink of annihilation?
You should redo it. That can't be the rock, flag, and eagle.
That can't be the rock, flag, and eagle.
They're struggling. I've never seen them struggle.
No, it can't be able to translate it. It's terrible.
Rock, flag, and transformation.
There you go.